At first, someone believed that Vanitas Linworm, a cold-blooded marquis son from a certain novel, was a ruthless aristocrat. He enslaved others, committed countless atrocities, and ultimately met a dark, lonely end. But then, that person realized the unthinkable. They had been reincarnated as that hated character, abandoned, despised, and destined for doom. Inside a grand palace, Vanitas sat before a mirror, studying his reflection. He touched his face and thought, so this is Vanitas's face. His body appeared frail, and he guessed he was around 15 years old. Though his thoughts were still hazy, his memories were gradually returning. When he had first awakened in this unfamiliar world, he didn't even know who he was. He remembered the moment clearly now. His father calling out in relief that Vanitas was awake, and his mother crying, clutching his hand and calling him Vana-chan. A butler and a maid stood silently in the background. According to them, he had been unconscious for 3 days and nights. Now, seated on his bed, Vanitas placed a glass on the nearby table and reflected on how little he had understood back then. But as fragments of memory returned, a realization took hold. In his past life, he had lived in an entirely different world, one of towering skyscrapers and crowded city streets. Nostalgic images burned in his mind. In that world, he had once read a novel. The title escaped him, but one thing remained vivid. Vanitas had appeared in it. A villain through and through, Vanitas had enslaved the heroines and forced them into servitude. Eventually, the protagonist defeated him, reclaiming the heroines. In the end, Vanitas himself was enslaved and died alone. Why am I here? He wondered. Who am I really? One thing was clear. If he continued down the same path as the character from the novel, his fate was sealed. Determined not to meet the same tragic end, Vanitas clenched his fists and made a vow. He would change his destiny. From that moment on, he began gathering information. He stacked books on the table and declared to himself, "It's time." Sitting down to read, he thought about the inevitable duel with the protagonist. It seemed unavoidable, a fixed point in the story. But was there any way to survive, or even win? Suddenly, his eyes widened. Magic! He muttered in disbelief. In this world, magic existed, elemental forces that could manipulate fire and water, even alter appearances. Through sheer imagination, spells could accomplish the impossible. In the original novel, Vanitas had only used a simple long-range spell called Light Arrow. But if his memory served him right, there existed a long-forgotten magic, one so powerful and complex it had been deemed impossible to master. A myth within the world, a bit of fan service from the author. And yet, he remembered it. Staggering to his feet in shock, Vanitas's heart pounded. This is it. He had found his chance. Suddenly, his hand began to glow, and he recognized it as domination magic. The ability to manipulate the magic floating in space to control all matter at will. Then, the glow faded, and Vanitas figured it would take some time before he could use it properly. Still, he smiled, thinking that with this power, he might be able to change his doomed fate. The scene shifted back to the palace, where Vanitas was sleeping in bed. He mumbled in his sleep, sat up with a yawn, and wondered if it was already morning. He recalled spending most of the night reading magic books, as expected from a marquis's house. Their collection had been quite impressive. When he heard a knock at the door, he thought the people here seemed kind. A maid entered with tea and nervously greeted him with a good morning, telling him that his clothes and drink were ready. Still sitting on the bed, Vanitas told her to just leave them there, and she nodded. As he returned to his reading, he noticed something odd. The maids in the house were stiff in their movements. Watching her hands tremble, Vanitas realized the reason was obvious. Suddenly, the maid cried out nervously that his hand was on her. Vanitas looked down and saw that his hand was resting on her buttocks. He responded absent-mindedly, realizing his mistake, and the maid quickly ran off, asking to be excused. Looking down at his hand, Vanitas thought that the original version of himself had likely harassed the maids and used violence. His hand had moved unconsciously. He figured that even if his personality had changed after reincarnation, old habits died hard. Still, he couldn't afford to dwell on that moment. Today was important. As he changed clothes, he thought there were likely two key reasons behind Vanitas's downfall. The first was losing to the protagonist. The second was losing his 3 enslaved heroines. Even if he beat the protagonist, it would mean nothing if the heroines left him. Vanitas recalled their names and backgrounds. Christina March was a noblewoman of high birth whose elegance and pride made her seem anything but a slave. Hildegard was a cheerful, battle-loving foreign knight. Rapina was a rare beastkin with smooth, black fur. Vanitas thought that today would be his first time meeting them. It was his chance to build a good relationship with those tied to his fate. But beyond strategy, he truly wanted to meet them. In his hazy memories, their smiling faces had left a lasting impression. However, when Vanitas finally saw them, the smiles he remembered were nowhere to be seen. Instead, they stood with scared and lifeless expressions. Their eyes were hollow. Christina addressed him as master, and Rapina asked what his orders were for the day. Vanitas looked at them tensely. He understood that slaves who had suffered under the old Vanitas couldn't possibly see him kindly, but he couldn't leave things as they were. He apologized for calling them out so suddenly, saying he had simply wanted to see them. Their faces didn't soften. Vanitas called Christina to step forward, and she hesitated before doing so. He remembered a scene from the novel where she complimented his looks. If that moment had any meaning, he figured it was worth testing. As she approached, he greeted her warmly. Christina blushed and flinched, quickly pushing him away while apologizing. Vanitas cut her off gently, admitting he had gotten too close and explaining that he simply wanted to see her face more clearly. He complimented her smooth skin and clear, strong eyes, saying that the more he looked, the more beautiful she appeared. Christina turned redder and told him not to say such strange things, calling him unfair. Vanitas noticed she avoided his gaze and figured that Christina probably did like the original Vanitas's looks. So if someone she despised complimented her, that reaction made sense. Next, he called for Rapina, who trembled as she stepped forward. Vanitas recalled that, out of the 3, Rapina had likely suffered the worst abuse from the original Vanitas. Because of her small size and quiet nature, she had been an easy target. He even remembered scenes in the novel where she was physically assaulted. When Rapina sat on his lap, blushing and making small distressed sounds, Christina panicked and asked what he was doing. Vanitas wondered if Rapina truly believed he was going to hurt her. Slowly raising his hand, he gently patted her head and complimented her fur, saying it was so soft he could touch it forever. Rapina blushed even deeper, stammering and trembling. Christina, still nervous, asked him not to be too rough. Vanitas replied that he just wanted to touch her a little longer, asking if that wasn't okay. Rapina let out more shy, flustered sounds, and Vanitas noted that she didn't seem to be rejecting him. He then asked if he could touch her tail too, and Rapina gave another embarrassed reaction. Christina, blushing as she watched, finally shouted at Vanitas to stop. She pulled Rapina away and pleaded for him to just tell them what he wanted. Rapina remained flustered, and Vanitas thought it was a shame. He had wanted to touch her more. He also wondered if he had just made her even more afraid of him. Looking at the girls, Vanitas realized the only one left was Hildegard, who had been silently watching him for a while. She finally spoke, saying her master was strong but weak, weak but strong. Vanitas, slightly taken aback, remembered that Hildegard was the daughter of a warrior from the Lepet tribe. The Lepet were a people who respected strength and protected the weak. The original Vanitas, lacking both strength and magic ability, had been someone she was supposed to guard. But now, as she looked at him, she sensed that something was different, that he wasn't the same Vanitas. Hildegard then said she wanted to fight him to find out the truth. Vanitas, understanding the values of her tribe, accepted her challenge. Soon, they stood facing each other in an open field. Vanitas prepared himself for the mock battle, planning to test his new power. He invoked domination magic, eager to see what it could do in actual combat. Looking across the field, Vanitas said the location should be fine and told Hildegard it was time to begin. He reminded himself that Hildegard was the daughter of the Lepet warriors. In a real fight, he knew he wouldn't walk away unharmed. But this was a mock battle, his chance to test domination magic and see if it worked in live combat. Christina shouted that it was far too dangerous and insisted that if he wanted a mock battle, she could do it instead, just like they usually did. Vanitas refused, saying that doing it that way would defeat the purpose. This was his chance to prove to everyone that he had changed. Reborn as a reincarnator, he declared himself the new Vanitas Lindworm. Both Christina and Rapina were stunned by his words. Vanitas then turned to Hildegard and told her not to hold back. Hildegard nodded and accepted his command. Without hesitation, she took a fighting stance and immediately fired a mud shot. Christina and Rapina gasped. As the attack flew toward him, Vanitas raised his hand and tried to activate his magic, but the mud struck him square in the chest. Everyone froze. Vanitas collapsed onto the ground, and Rapina rushed to his side, asking if he was okay. Christina shouted that this was exactly why she had warned him. It was too dangerous. Still lying on the ground, Vanitas muttered in frustration. Then, while standing up and laughing, he admitted there was no way something like this would work perfectly on the first try. He turned to Hildegard and told her to come at him again, just like before. Christina looked at him, worried, but Vanitas reassured her that he would be fine. As he wiped the mud from his face, he reminded himself that Hildegard's magic was mud-based. He had expected to take some hits, but this was the only way forward. He told them to continue. Hildegard nodded, a little unsure, and resumed the mock battle. She fired several mud shots in quick succession. This time, Vanitas dodged them smoothly, surprising both Christina and Rapina. Christina whispered his name in disbelief. Another mud shot came flying. Vanitas saw it coming, raised his hand, and took the impact while shielding his eyes. Hildegard smiled at the exchange. The scene shifted upward, toward the sky. Vanitas stood before her, his beautiful face covered in mud. Watching him, Christina murmured her concern about his face being such a mess. Breathing heavily, Vanitas asked Hildegard if she was enjoying herself. She smiled and replied that while he was still weak, he was much stronger than before. And yes, it was fun. Still catching his breath, Vanitas announced that the next strike would be the last. He told her he would now show her what he could really do. Hildegard's expression turned serious. She asked if they were about to fight for real. Vanitas confirmed it and told her to come at him with everything she had. Both Christina and Rapina watched tensely. Hildegard responded that she would now use her full power and began chanting. Then she shouted, "Mud Spiral Bomb!" and fired a large magic attack. Christina and Rapina both looked alarmed. Vanitas raised his hand and invoked domination magic. The powerful spell was dismantled mid-air. Christina stared, stunned, and exclaimed that the master had just deflected the magic. Right after, Vanitas dashed forward, grabbed Hildegard's hand, and used magic to seal her movements. Hildegard fell to the ground, restrained and blushing. I can't move. What is this?" she asked, flustered. Vanitas knelt in front of her and calmly explained that this was all the power he could currently manage. Using domination magic, he had condensed the ambient mana around them. At this moment, even if she gave it everything she had, she wouldn't be able to break free. He reassured her that there was no need to worry. The binding would wear off soon. But suddenly, Vanitas collapsed to the ground. Both Christina and Rapina screamed his name and rushed to his side. Christina lifted him into her arms, asking if he was okay. Vanitas, breathing weakly, replied that he was fine and apologized, calling her Fuku. The binding spell faded, and Hildegard, looking confused, softly called out to her master. Vanitas turned to her, and Hildegard told him that what he had done was incredible, but that he felt different now, like a completely different person. Still tense, Christina asked what exactly a reincarnated one was. Vanitas stayed silent for a moment, then laid back on the ground and said that he was who he was, and that their previous master, the one who had oppressed them, was gone. All three of them, Christina, Rapina, and Hildegard, looked shocked. Christina asked what he meant by that. Vanitas explained that he knew how strange it must sound, but from that moment forward, he would be fighting against fate. To do that, he needed their strength. He called Christina's name, and she quickly responded, her voice nervous. Then he called Rapina, who replied quietly. Finally, he called Hildegard, and she answered with a smile. Vanitas looked at the three of them and said that while there was still a lot they didn't understand, he hoped they would come with him. Raising his hand toward them, he said that he would be counting on all three from now on.